It's November, so I'm looking at Game Boy Color games for some reason. Today's game is Donkey Kong Country. Now, I really like the original Donkey Kong Country games on the Super Nintendo. In fact, they're half the reason I even keep my Super Nintendo around. I wasn't exactly expecting a one-to-one conversion here, but I was expecting a fun game, so let's see what we have here. You are Donkey Kong and Diddy Kong, and you are out on a quest to go rescue your bananas or something. If you've played the original game, then you'll know exactly what to expect, because you run, you jump, you bounce off enemies, you throw barrels, etc. The game doesn't quite feel like the original. I think the original feels a lot better to play, but it's still not bad, even though it's very much a downgrade, because you still get that bouncy feel to it, but the running and jumping just doesn't feel as smooth. If you played Donkey Kong Land, then it's kind of like that one. In fact, a lot of the music in this game was reused from Donkey Kong Land. A lot of the levels here are pretty recognizable. There's not a ton of big surprises here. There are some differences, but for the most part, it's a pretty faithful representation of the original. It's not all good though. For one, I had a heck of a time with these levels where you need to shoot yourself out of these barrels with the right timing, as they seemed very delayed in their firing. Also, I was going to complain about how hard the minecart level is and how you basically need to memorize it, but while recording footage for this video, I pretty much got through it my first time without getting hit once, so interpret that as you will. You've also got a couple of new minigames here, so that's something I guess. And you can even print things out with the Game Boy printer, because of course you can. So if you wanted to print out the whole alphabet with Donkey Kong characters surrounding it, then you can. Although to be honest, I'm not so sure how I feel about that J. So that's Donkey Kong Country on Game Boy Color. It's pretty faithful, but also not very faithful at the same time, if that makes any sense. It's still a decent game in its own right, but at the end of the day, it just makes me wish I was playing the Super Nintendo version instead. Because unlike the Donkey Kong Land games, there's really not enough new stuff here to make it stand out in comparison, but judging it on its own, it's still a pretty decent platformer. But that's just what I think. So now I'm actually going to bring on a special guest, because my friend Mo wanted to share some of his thoughts on this game, because he knows a lot more about Donkey Kong Country than I do. So, take it away, Mo.
Thank you, Reg Reed, for giving me the time of day to give my crappy opinion on this crappy version of Donkey Kong Country. I was looking forward to playing this for a long time, as it was one of the few mainline DK games I was missing in my collection. And after beating the game, I can say it's not the worst Game Boy Color title, but is a butchered rendition of a Super Nintendo masterpiece. The main gripe I have with this game is that a lot of the assets are ripped straight from Donkey Kong Land. In that game, the Kongs handle fine on the ground, but fall like bowling balls when in midair. Considering every level with the exception of one new exclusive, Necky Nutmare, is based off the original DKC, you'd think they'd handle fine. But not with Donkey Kong Land's physics. Any level that requires precise platforming feels like a Kaizo hack due to the apparent heavy gravity, and if you thought enemies would blindside you in the Super Nintendo version, then expect the unfair disadvantage when playing on a smaller screen. Some levels are made arbitrarily harder, such as Elevator Antics and Minecart Carnage, requiring near perfection to play through without dying, yet some of the harder originals are made easier, like Platform Barrels, where the platforms move way slower, making the precise parts of the level a walk in the park. The final boss is even a pushover because the cannonballs are much easier to avoid, and the final phase has no differentiating pattern to throw players off like before. Another thing that's blood-boiling is that this game requires 3 full playthroughs in order to achieve 101%. Even when finding all the bonus barrels and colored bananas exclusive in this cartridge, Cranky will say he would have found everything, meaning if you want that completion marker, you'll have to play through the entire game again without checkpoints and another time without Diddy. At least Donkey Kong Country 3 on the Super Nintendo had the more respectable difficulty option, but this game wants you to play through it thrice just to get the same percentage you can get in the first game in just a sitting. This game was also made obsolete due to the full-fledged remakes of the Super Nintendo trilogy arriving on the Game Boy Advance. The DKC-1 version on that handheld is a much better title, as its handling mimics the original, meaning no random deaths relating to screen crunch or falling too fast. If you're in the mood for a good version of Donkey Kong Country on a handheld, ignore this game completely and pick up the Game Boy Advance port instead. It even makes the minigames from here a lot more fun and has a decent hard mode where you play as Diddy with no checkpoints. It's also not required to play through it for a total completion, and it's a nice reward for beating the game normally. To sum it up, you're better off playing any other version of Donkey Kong Country over the Game Boy Color version. At least the music is still S tier, while it uses Wise's compositions from Donkey Kong Land, so I'd recommend looking up the OST if you're curious about what those tunes sound like in 8-bit, if that's up your alley. Still, don't play this version of the game, even if the soundtrack is bliss. Nobody will get mad at you if you choose the other versions over this, so just play them and have fun with Donkey Kong Country that way.
So yeah, there's a second opinion on this game from my friend Mo. So basically, he's a little harsher about this one than I probably would be, but at the same time, I don't really disagree with him about any of it. But at the end of the day, it's Donkey Kong Country on Game Boy Color, and it is a game.